Following the disaster year in the Netherlands and its gradual decline, the mantle for the most advanced country and the economic and military superpower of the world will then go to England, which England will be able to claim for about 200 years until it's taken over by the United States. And the advancements in the Netherlands will spread directly to England. There is a direct correlation through the person of the Prince of Orange. So how exactly did this happen? In order to understand how England will become the world power and how William of Orange will revolutionize the country, you need to understand a little bit of background. Because the whole thing is surprisingly improbable. England, Great Britain, it's a very small country. When you compare it to the United States, it is very small. But more importantly, when you compare it to the rest of the world, it's tiny. How on earth could this little tiny country become the world military and economic superpower? Well, like with the Netherlands, a big factor was geography. So, for one, it benefited because it was really far from the Roman Empire. This means that the Roman Empire had less control from the very beginning. There was less control from Italy, so there was a looser political system. And this means that when the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, in a lot of other places, very hierarchical Roman system took over, like a very top-down feudal system. It was extractive governments usually replace other extractive governments. However well-intentioned revolutions are, which we'll talk about later, they usually result in just another extractive government coming around. England was different because it was so far from Italy and from the Roman Empire. It became a really messy patchwork of a bunch of feuding fiefdoms. So a bunch of local leaders competing against each other, which is very similar to what happened in Denmark. So there were competing centers of power, meaning England was a more pluralistic society and there was more division. There was more competition among these feuding lords, which, again, pluralism in all forms means more competition, which is good for a society to advance. So its sheer distance from Rome was a benefit. Another really important benefit is that it is an island nation. Because it's an island nation, this has a lot of implications, but it is separated from the rest of Europe by the English Channel, so it is more isolated. It's more difficult to invade, and inherently, it had a smaller population. And having a small population will actually be a benefit for it in the long run. And finally, the fact that it's island meant that it will have to develop a merchant fleet and a navy just like the Netherlands. Inherently, if it's going to trade or do anything, it has to have a navy and a merchant fleet, which is absolutely instrumental during this period in deciding which country will be a world power. That is what made the Netherlands so powerful, and that is what will make England so powerful. It will develop the best navy in human history up to that point. So geographically, it had a lot of advantages, and it also had a background that made it susceptible to becoming a more advanced society. I'm not going to go into the whole history of England, but just a couple key important events. It will develop institutions that are more inclusive, as you'd say. Going all the way back to King John, he was like most Europeans, he was always at war. He went to war with King Philip II of France, not to be mistaken with King Philip II of Spain. Trying to remember all the kings of the European nations is so many of them, and they're always at war. So he will launch a disastrous war, and the war will be so bad that he will be forced. There will be a civil war because he has to raise taxes. And this will lead him to be forced to signing what's called the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta guaranteed protections and rights for the barons or lords in England. So it will curtail some of the power of the monarch. And it did a lot of things, but fundamentally what it did is limit the power of the crown and give more power to the barons and the nobility that is below the crown. So it makes it for a little bit more equitable political system, just a little bit. And it's an important step in the evolution of England becoming a constitutional monarchy. So it is one step, but it is a very important step. So it will develop that way. And accordingly, it will develop representative government. It will develop a parliament. By 1300, there will be a parliament of sorts, and the members were lawmakers in their own right. So they weren't just advisors to the king, but these are representatives that would meet, and they would constrain the power of the king. So they're constraining royal authority, but they were also working with the king. So it wasn't like it was just a contentious relationship all the time. The country's elites would work through the parliament and with the king. So they are both constraining the power of the king, but the fact that they are actually able to meet and able to vote on stuff like taxes meant they're actually giving the king and the central government more authority and more legitimacy because they had a say in it. So the government institutions that were being established were starting to be more inclusive and were receptive to it. Economically, it would also have there would be a lot of things that would lead England to develop a very advanced economy for the time. For one, as mentioned before, the Black Death. The number of people in England that died, 30 to 50% will die in England. And so the country's total population will just dramatically decrease. Now, as mentioned before, in Eastern Europe, the way they dealt with it was by passing laws demanding that the workers, the population, laborers, stayed on their land. So they adopted very oppressive policies. In England, it was different. The decline in population meant the surviving farm workers were in much greater demand. And so it will actually raise wages and the standard of living for laborers in England. So it will have the effect of making England a more economically inclusive society. Related to that, it will become more modernized economically. Now, it obviously is today, it's very quaint to call this modern, but wool, sheep will be absolutely instrumental into England developing a modern economic system. Because there were so few merchants, because there were so few farmers, the public land had been used by farmers. It started to be used for sheep, because then sheep would produce wool. And wool turned out to be more economically lucrative. So because of that, England will develop the enclosure movement. This is where, instead of land being just open, free to use, because you can't really do that with sheep, they will develop enclosure, which means taking all the public lands and parceling them out, dividing them up, privatizing them, so giving them to private citizens. Obviously, in this case, it's still nobility, a landowning nobility, and then turned into pasture land for sheep. And this is really important because it moved the country from subsistence farming, that's where you're farming just to survive, to market farming. And that is part of the new economic revolution taking place. It's a market commercial revolution, where instead of just growing food to survive, which is what most farmers did throughout most of history, you're now growing enough that you can sell it at the market and then use that money to buy other things. So it is a more advanced economic system. So it will move to the enclosure movement will move the country more towards a more advanced system. Now, obviously, this is bad for average farmers, for the peasants, but this was such a lucrative trade that it led to higher wages for wool manufacturing. So you have to, wool by itself, you can't do much with it. You have to have a worker or laborer to turn that wool into a product. That's what manufacturing and industry is. It's taking a raw product, turning it into something like a shirt. So in cities, farmers would start moving into the cities to work in wool manufacturing, and they would quite often get higher wages. And so obviously they're working for someone else now, but it did mean a little bit better of a standard of living. Now, obviously there's all sorts of problems with industrialization we'll talk about later, but there was a bit higher of a standard of living. And those landowning nobility or gentry, they worked with and not against the rising merchants. So in the cities, you'd have merchants that set up factories to turn the wool into manufactured goods. And like in other places that are Netherlands, that was economically inclusive, now you have a class of people in society that are able to get wealthy and then challenge the nobility. But in a lot of places, the two would fight against each other and work against each other. In England, that didn't happen. They ended up working together. So landowning nobility, so inherited wealth, nobility, titles, all that, worked with, not against, the rising class of entrepreneurs, of merchants, of craftsmen. So there's economic modernization happening. And it was happening without the conservative reactionary backlash that happened in a lot of other places. That term I used before, and I will use many times again, creative destruction. Whenever there is economic change and advancement, there's always people left behind. But in England's case, the two groups that potentially could have been left behind, landowning nobility and laborers, they actually were able to do well in this new economy. So the enclosure movement led the country to a more advanced economic system. And as the peasants, as the workers are moving into the city, as new factories are springing up, the country would also urbanize. And it would become much more urbanized than England would become much more urbanized than most other places in Europe, excluding the Netherlands. And eventually it will become more urban than the Netherlands. And so it will have many cities. And it's really important. It didn't have just one dominant city that ruled everything. Like that's what France was. Paris ruled everything. In England, there will be many distinct, thriving cities that had their own economic specialty. And you definitely don't have to know the names, but like Manchester specialized in textiles, Birmingham specialized in forged metal tools, Newcastle specialized in coal. So they're specializing in different things, but there's no one single dominant city. So that means power and wealth is more distributed. There is urban and economic pluralism. And again, pluralism means there's competition, and competition is healthy to an extent. And in England's case, it turned out very beneficial for the country as a whole. Because as we'll see, once anyone tries to take over one area, there's just too many places that have too much independence and too much of its own political and economic power. But it wasn't just the cities that did well. Rural countryside, they modernized as well. The countryside thrived and modernized too. By the early 1700s, about 40% of Englishmen in rural areas were engaged in trades other than just farming, especially mining and manufacturing. So even in rural areas, they weren't left out, that's always a big problem when a country industrializes and becomes more urban. Usually rural areas are left out of that advancement. But in England's case, it was able to advance economically, have a more diverse economy, and it will adapt to the economic transformations taking place. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but overall, as a generalization, it was adapting and it was changing. So it will be ready to industrialize, which will eventually lead it to be the world superpower. And important to that, it will have a relatively large middle class. Now, obviously, a lot of people's lives were terrible because the past is just terrible, all of it. You don't want to live in the past. But relative to other places in not just Europe and the rest of the world, there was, in an advanced economy, there was a relatively large middle class that could participate in parliamentary government. So they would have more power and more say. Again, you would not call this a democratic system by any stretch of the imagination, but it was more democratic relative to other places in the world. So it will have an economy that is ready for change and to be advanced. There will also be a religious revolution that will make it ready for inclusive change. And in terms of religion, it was started by this guy right here. This is going to seem like a very bold claim, but possibly one of the most ridiculous humans in history. It might be a bit too broad of a statement, but King Henry VIII was really, really ridiculous person. And not just because he had 6 wives. And this isn't at all a criticism of the Church of England. You can take any religion or any denomination and find something to criticize. As an individual, though, he was fairly ridiculous. He wanted to get a divorce from one of his wives. The Pope said no. And his wife, Catherine of Aragon, he wasn't allowed to get a divorce from. So he decided, you know what? I don't want to be part of the Catholic Church. So I'm going to create my own church. So the Protestant Reformation will come to England through King Henry VIII, and he will create the Church of England. So this is the part of the English Reformation, it's called. It's taking the Protestant Reformation and bringing it into England. Now, the Church of England, Protestantism had a lot of differences from Catholicism theologically. Like in terms of its structure, they're very different. In terms of the belief system, there are some very important differences. One major one I'll note is in the Catholic Church, they had salvation by works. So you can earn your way into heaven, which one of the big critiques of Martin Luther and other Protestants was at the time you could buy your way into heaven. So if you paid enough money, you could get to the front of the line in heaven. So that didn't sit well with a lot of Protestants. So Martin Luther, one of his arguments, and that will be adopted by John Calvin and Calvinism, which is, of course, which was dominant in the Netherlands, is salvation by grace. So you can't earn your way into heaven. If God is omnipotent and omnipresent, knows all, and is all powerful, God knows whether you're going to heaven or hell before you're even born. You are predestined. The only way you can get into heaven is salvation by grace, or the grace of God. So it is salvation by works or salvation by grace. It's where the song Amazing Grace comes from. The Church of England did not adopt that belief system. So a lot of the aspects of Protestantism, a lot of the things that the Protestants were criticizing the Catholic Church from, stayed with the Church of England. Because it's not like King Henry VIII had he didn't care about the theology. He cared that he couldn't divorce a wife. Also, when the Church of England was created, it is the established church in England. It looks just like the Catholic Church. It acts just like the Catholic Church, but it is technically a Protestant church because it's protesting the Church of England. But in all ways, shapes, and forms, it looked like it, except who do you think the Pope is in this new Church of England? That's right, King Henry VIII. So now he just has more power. So instead of the Catholic Church being important in England, now the Church of England is the established church. And he is not only the head of the country, king of the country, he is the head of the established church. So, and he also got to take all the Catholic lands. So it just gave him much more power. And that's his suit of armor. When I say he's a ridiculous human being, I mean, it is just so ridiculous. Just so we are clear, there is no biological reason that is necessary. That is, he basically has like a super lifted truck, essentially, that has one of those loud engines that, come on, man. Anyway, he got a lot more power because of this in the short term. It give him a lot more power in the short term. But in the long term, what he did, the English Reformation encouraged Englishmen to question authority more. And from the very beginning, he will start getting pushback. Now, you don't have to memorize this by any means, but we'll come back to this when we talk about the United States or the British colonization of America. There will be Protestants that are unhappy with the Church of England because they say it didn't change enough. So you have the Catholic Church, and then you have the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation includes all sorts of religions, Calvinist, Baptist. One of those is the Church of England. And in the United States, the Anglican Church, that is the Church of England. After the American Revolution, all the Church of England became the Anglican Church. So that is the origin, so different name. The Church of England was so much like the Catholic Church, though, there will be Protestants that say the Church of England needs to be cleaned up so it can change to be more like, or so to be less like the Catholic Church. And these people that believe that are called Puritans. Puritans are people that wanted the Church of England to be purified of all those Catholic hangovers. And so all Puritans are Englishmen that are Protestants that want to purify the Church of England. So all Puritans are a form of Protestants, but not all Protestants are Puritans. Puritans are specifically in England. And English Puritans will be important in founding the United States. And there will be two main branches of Puritans. Separatists are ones that said the Church of England is so corrupt that we need to just separate from them totally. And that was treason. So they will have to flee England. And they are the ones we call the Pilgrims of Plymouth. The ones that supposedly had the first Thanksgiving, which is not true. The first Thanksgiving was in Virginia. But if we want to get really technical about the first time Europeans and Native Americans celebrated some sort of Thanksgiving, it was the Spanish in New Mexico. So what is now New Mexico? Pilgrims are overrated. The more important group are the non-separatists. Those are the Puritans that want to purify the Church of England, but from the inside. They don't want to separate. And those Puritans that we'll talk about more later, they will create Massachusetts Bay. And they are much more important. So they don't want to separate from the Church of England, but they want to purify the Church of England and change it. So there will be, from the very beginning, there will be division religiously after the establishment of the Church of England. So there is religious pluralism. Now, as you would expect, of course, there was also political division. And the political division will be between the same two factions, kind of that we saw in the Netherlands. There will be some people that supported the absolutist monarchs, like they had in France. Absolute monarchs, where the king has all power. And then there will be other people that support a decentralized republic, like the Protestants in Netherlands. Absolutists tended to be Catholic. They, tended to be nobility, king and the king. And the people that supported decentralized Republican government, they drew inspiration from Protestant Netherlands and wanted a more decentralized system. So that will be the political division that will exist, and it will come to a head under this guy right here, Charles I. Charles I will believed in the divine right of kings. So he was one of those that believed in an absolute monarchy. He wanted to take all power to himself. And he will fight relentlessly with Parliament. And he was opposed by most people in England, especially because he wanted the power to tax without Parliament's consent. And that was a fundamentally important part of the power structure, political power structure in England, which obviously will spread to America. But that one in particular, taxing without Parliament's consent, will piss off a lot of people in England. And he will make a lot of religious reforms to make England a little bit more Catholic. That will lead to a Puritan revolt. the Puritans in England will revolt, and it will be kind of Puritans in Parliament versus Catholics and Charles I. And this was a major, major civil war in that it involved 1 in 8 Englishmen were involved. More than 150,000 people were killed until eventually Parliament will be victorious. Parliament was victorious. They were able to capture Charles I in 1645. And even after he's captured, he refused to accept constitutional monarchy. That is, staying a monarchy where there's a king, but there's a constitution that limits the king's power. So even after this guy is captured, he is still not willing to accept a constitutional monarchy. He wants to be absolutist king. He has all the power. And so in 1649, they chopped off his head. So they will abolish the monarchy. And when they abolish the monarchy, for the very first and only time in England's history, they will adopt a Republican government. So for the one and only time in England's history, they just get rid of the monarchy and they have a Republican government. Now, you might be thinking, oh, Republican government. Well, that's good. Must be more freedom. No, not at all. This was an example of revolutions are messy, and this was not an example of a good democratic society that was believed in human rights and opposed absolute authority, which you would expect. It was known to be very violent, very illiberal, and very repressive. And it will be just a decade of escalating radicalization and constant political infighting, which will eventually lead to Oliver Cromwell taking over. This guy Oliver Cromwell, he'll be elected Lord Protector in 1953, and the way most revolutions go, there's radical change, and then that radical change leads to instability. That instability leads to electing someone who will become a dictator, because when there's too much instability, people want stability, so they will elect a dictator. And Cromwell is that guy. Cromwell will dissolve the parliament in 1655, 2 years after being elected, and he will usher in a period of military dictatorship. So he will change England from being a parliamentary system. There's a king and a parliament that are fighting, to just completely getting rid of that, making himself the dictator, and making England into a military dictatorship. He divided England into 10 different regions. Each one of those regions is governed by a general that answers to Cromwell. Now, just so you know, there are different forms of government. Military dictatorships, there has never been one that exists that is a free society. You don't want to live in a military dictatorship. They are not good, to put it mildly. That's why civilian control is a fundamental part of any democratic government. This was a period that was, again, it was not, you would expect it to be more democratic, but it wasn't. It was incredibly oppressive. The oppressiveness of the government was for a lot of reasons, but Puritan hardliners were the ones that took control. So Puritan hardliners will impose strict Calvinist theology on society. And Cromwell, he will pass laws he wanted what he called a reformation of manners. He wanted to bring moral regeneration. back to society through the suppression of vice and the encouragement of virtue. So using the government to suppress out all the vice and bring back morals because of all the moral regeneration. Again, it's what happens whenever there's a lot of radical change. People don't like that, so they always want to go back to a period where it was more pure, more strict religion, and that is what he will bring in. All sorts of ridiculous things, banned theater, even Shakespeare literally declared a war on Christmas, denounced the holiday as debauchery and frivolous and pagan, which a lot of Christmas traditions are derived from paganism. But, it's still a fun holiday. So they actually will launch what should sound very familiar, a culture war. Now, the culture war at that time was a war on acting, singing, dancing, partying, everything fun, censoring all sorts of books, censoring everything that is considered debauchery or bad manners. So this period, the Commonwealth period, the Republic period, it is not a pretty period. And it will be so unpleasant. Cromwell will die in 1958. His son tries to keep it going, but people in England, they just had enough. They just had enough after this. They were so sick of it that they will actually, after 10 years of just flopping around after the death of Charles I, they will be like, all right, you know what? This is terrible. And they'll ask Charles I's son to come in and take over. So after 10 years of trying to have a Calvinist society, having a Republican government, it had ended up being a military dictatorship and a theocracy. So many people in England lost so many rights that they were just sick of it. So in 1660, after 10 years, about 10 years, they just said, you know what, let's bring in Charles I's son, that guy whose head we cut off. Let's ask his son to come back so we can, let's ask his son to come back so we can go back to the way things were. That's how bad it was during this period. So they will bring in Charles I's son, Charles II. Hey, sorry about your dad. You want to be king again? Charles II will say, yeah, sounds fun. He'll come back with the stipulation he didn't take revenge on all the people that supported the revolution, except the people that were responsible for beheading his father. So there'll be some people that will be tried and quartered and executed, including the dead body of Oliver Cromwell. They dug up the dead body of Oliver Cromwell and hacked it up and put the head on a spike. If you want to be mildly amused, look up the story of Oliver Cromwell's head, because it traveled all around for some reason. They left the head on a spike and it fell off, and then someone found it and stole it. And anyway, but with the Restoration, everything went back to the way things had been for quite a while. So after the Restoration, things were okay. Charles II, he was fine. People were fine with him. That is until he passed away. When he passed away in 1686, his brother became king. Charles II was, he was probably a closet Catholic. He didn't throw it around. He knew his power was limited. He had been brought back in. So he was not, he didn't throw his weight around as much. His brother had no qualms with that. So James II, his brother, who became king in 1686, will come in, and he was an absolutist Catholic monarch. So he wants to go all out into Catholic absolutist monarch government, where he can do whatever he wants. And the country divided politically. And the two parties, and this is important to know these terms, were the Whigs Whigs were anyone that was anti-James, and there's anti-monarchical. And these are the parties that are still around to this day. The Whig Party is anti-James, anti-monarchical. You would call it more the people, the party for the people. And then the Tories. Tories were pro-James and pro-monarchist. And that is what you call the elitists, or the elites in society. So Tories were more traditionalist. They supported the king more. Whigs were anti-James, anti-monarchical. So James, he will come in, and he was really, really unpopular. And he was trying to bring back the absolute monarchist governments and Catholicism, which was so unpopular that the Tories and the Whigs, they would actually unite in their dislike of James. They would dislike him so much they actually united. And even English Catholics did not like him, and he was a Catholic. So it wasn't just about religion. It was that he was trying to take too much power for himself, for the monarch. And so even Catholics didn't like him. Tories didn't like him, Whigs didn't like him, Catholics didn't like him. And because he was trying to bring back an extreme French-style absolutism. So this wasn't just about religion. This was about rejecting a political system where there is a king that has absolutist power. So conservative Tories, the Tories are conservative. Whigs are liberal, but conservative Tories and liberal Whigs agreed to reject the extremes of Catholic absolutism and of radical republicanism. And so this will lead to William of Orange. William of Orange, he was married, so he's 22 years old. He had married James II's daughter, Mary II. So he was married to the daughter of James II. So there was a tie between William of Orange of the Netherlands, the guy who was in charge because French King Louis XIV let him stay in power because they thought he was really conservative. He was married to the daughter of James II. So conservative Tories, liberal Whigs, they decided, let's invite William of Orange to be the new king in England. And this is when this is how we get all the benefits of the Netherlands will be transferred to England. All the strengths of the Netherlands are transferred to England. William of Orange, he had been a conservative in the Netherlands. And he did some things that were manipulative and can obviously be criticized, like when the French invaded in the Netherlands, in order to gain power, he said stuff that even he knew wasn't true, like the States Party, if you remember they're called, that opposed him. He said they were traitors and they were working with France. And so when some of his political opponents were being executed, he just sat by and didn't do anything. And he will use some of the same tactics to become King of England in 1688. He used very anti-Catholic rhetoric, which that appealed to a lot of people in England. And he used it's called the Irish Fright. People in England, they could not stand the Irish, and the Irish hated the people of England. And so William of Orange accused King James of bringing in thousands of Irish immigrants to massacre Protestants. It was like basically saying like, oh, that guy's bringing in immigrants to kill Protestants. 0% truth to that. But, famous saying by Hitler, if you want to make a lie, make it simple and say it often. That guy, my opponent, is bringing in immigrants to destroy you all. And it worked really well. So you wouldn't say William of Orange he was not above using manipulative tactics to gain power, but what's really important, he was not an all-out conservative. He was like an absolutist conservative. That's what King Louis, the French King Louis, had thought he was. He was not, though. He accepted religious toleration, religious pluralism, and most importantly, parliamentary supremacy. He accepted the supremacy of the legislature. So in the Netherlands, which happened to be extremely liberal in terms of like diffuse power, he had been a conservative, but compared to most absolutist monarchists, he was actually fairly liberal. So it was all relative. So the most important things, though, is he was willing to accept those. He accepted those things: religious toleration, pluralism, and parliamentary supremacy, which weren't even forced on him. He just believed in those things. So because of this, it's called the Glorious Revolution because it was a bloodless revolution. James, knowing that he was absolutely hated, he fled. And it's funny, dictators, autocrats, they tend to understand each other and get along. So James II will flee England and live with King Louis XIV for the rest of his life. He basically got a stipend, which is a very fancy way of saying an allowance. And, they got along fine. And William and Mary will come in. And this is a bloodless revolution. But William will bring in the Dutch politics and Dutch commerce. And it will transform England. England already had the background, but it'll transform England into the new superpower. And it does that in all sorts of ways. First, in 1689, they will pass a Bill of Rights and an Act of Toleration. The Bill of Rights was the first time royal authority was given power by an act of parliament or legislature. So the parliament enacted legislation to give the king power, but that made them into a constitutionally limited monarchy. So to this day, there obviously is still a monarchy in England, but it's constitutionally limited. So his powers were very limited. And this is an absolute defeat of absolutism. It's a defeat of absolutism and marked the supremacy of parliament and pluralistic political institutions. That means there's a lot of political parties, a lot of political factions, and they are able to compete with each other. So this new structure of government, there is a Bill of Rights that created the separation of powers. It settled issues of power between king and parliament. It allowed enhanced democratic elections, so it made the country more democratic or more inclusive, and it guaranteed freedom of speech. The Bill of Rights will serve as the model for the United States Bill of Rights, and it is the basis for the expansion of rights throughout England's history. So from this point on, it will only expand more and more. And the Act of Toleration will extend the Dutch-style religious tolerance into England. So England was a solidly Protestant nation, and it didn't allow absolute rights to Catholic, Jews, atheists, but it set England on the path of becoming a religiously open society, and there was religious tolerance. So the country wasn't consumed with religious infighting like it had been before. And more importantly than that, though, well, equally importantly, these acts set up a new form of government structure, and this was like a Goldilocks form of government. So they rejected the Republican Calvinism of the Netherlands, because Netherlands' problems was there was not a strong enough central government. That's why France could overrun it. Absolute Catholicism meant that there was too strong of a central government. So this government was both centralized and pluralistic, which, if that sounds familiar, that's the United States form of government. So there's still a king and queen, meaning there's still leadership and stability in a centralized system, which the Netherlands didn't have. But there's a parliament that allowed for representative government, a pluralistic legislature, and it created an effective centralized state. This created a modern, efficient government that had the power to tax and was able to change. And this government will be responsible for allowing England to become the world superpower. So under William and Mary, and with the Glorious Revolution, England will establish a government that is this perfect Goldilocks. And this was a bipartisan agreement. So Tories and Whigs are agreeing to reject royalist absolutism and Republican Calvinist extremes, and reject these extremes in polarization, because it is not good for any country to have extremes and polarization. So in rejecting these extremes, they created a government that was pluralistic, it was more pragmatic, and very importantly, it secured Parliament's power of the purse. That is, Parliament's power to raise taxes and raise revenue. That is very important, that that power is with legislatures rather than with dictators or kings, because then it means the people have a say in the taxes that are being put on them. So this will create a very pluralistic nation, and it will be very focused on business and profits, which will lead England to be the world economic superpower for about 200 years. So in effect, what they are doing is they are accepting pluralism, and pluralism is messy. When there is a bunch of competing interests, it is messy, it's confusing, it's a bit chaotic, but it is still the best systems that we have. And when I say pluralism, I mean like democratic government is pluralism. So you have a bunch of competing interests. Economic pluralism, capitalism, religious pluralism, religious freedom. That is instead of coercive uniformity, coercing people, everyone to think the same thing, that never goes well for a nation. So because it accepted pluralism, England would then benefit in a lot of ways. For one, it became the epicenter for immigration. So the Netherlands had been where everyone had gone, refugees had gone. But after 1688, after the Glorious Revolution, refugees will come to England over the Netherlands. Netherlands proved itself to be unreliable in terms of being able to defend itself. So refugees from all over, especially French Protestant Huguenots, will start coming to England instead of the Netherlands. And related to this, it will lead to England being an intellectual superpower. It has freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and it will be the epicenter for a lot of the Age of Enlightenment thinkers. This is when Isaac Newton and one of the most important of all Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, come back to England. John Locke was actually in the Netherlands, and he will return home to England after this. So having freedom of thought, having pluralistic society will allow England to become the industrial and economic superpower of the world. So there will be government and societal changes, and The English will also adopt a lot of the business practices. When William came over to England, a lot of important business people, a lot of financiers and Dutch statesmen will come with him. So England will adopt Dutch commercial modernization, and it will allow for relatively broad-based, inclusive economic participation. So that means a lot of people are able to benefit, that's what broad-based, and participate in the growing economy. And so it will lead to bigger middle class, more people doing well, and a bigger and more thriving merchant class. So again, merchant class, or having merchant class, it's another way to say businessmen. Having merchant class is very important and will be the basis, is the basis for countries becoming more economically and politically inclusive and rejecting absolutism and becoming more prosperous. So it will bring in a lot of business practices from the Netherlands, most notably, a couple of very notable ones. For one, Bank of England. This is obviously a direct, taken directly from the Bank of Amsterdam and what the Netherlands had. And it was like the Bank of Netherlands, but bigger and had more authority. So it is a central bank, which again are fundamentally important to creating an economic system that is stable. So central banks can criticize, there's plenty to criticize, but when you see systems without central banks, those are absolute chaos. So for all the problems of central banks like the Federal Reserve, they are better than not having them. And the Bank of England will be a joint stock company that was owned by both the public and the government. And it was a private bank that acted as a bank for the government and to control the financial system of the country. And this, if you've taken U.S. history, is the basis for Alexander Hamilton's Bank of the United States. So that is where Hamilton didn't invent that idea. He was looking at the best central bank the world had ever seen. So there's a Bank of England, which was taken directly from the Netherlands. Also, during this period, the British East India Trading Company will become the absolute dominant company, the most important multinational corporation in the world. It had been the Dutch East India Trading Company, but during this period, or after 1688, the British East India Trading Company will become the dominant company in the world. And there is tons you can criticize about the British East India Trading Company, especially about colonialism and what they did in colonialism. Just like today, there's a lot of things you can criticize about big corporations. There's tons. British East India Trading Company will do so many terrible things. It had, at its height, it had 260,000 soldiers, and by the mid 1700s and early 1800s, it will account for almost half of all trade in the world. It's so massive. But this is not to give a free pass to it, but corporations, they're just like governments. They're not good or bad. A corporation has one interest, and that is to make money. And so they will inevitably do things that most people would consider immoral, amoral at best. But you still would rather live in a country that has the most powerful corporations in the world, because that is the only way a country can be a world economic superpower. So if it comes down to it, like today, Amazon can criticize Amazon all day and all night, we'd still rather Amazon be an American company than go somewhere else, because it does make the entire U.S. economy stronger. Now, I can criticize Amazon all day and all night. Again, I'm not saying corporations should get a free pass and should be able to do whatever they want, but it is a sign. In order to be a world superpower, you need to have large companies, large corporations. And the British East India Trading Company will have huge effect in England. But for average people in England, it made a lot of their lives much better. In fact, it established the original consumer culture in England. Average English citizens, instead of wearing wool, which is, scratchy and itchy, it brought in cotton from India, which was much more comfortable. It also brought in tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean. So average English citizens' lives got better because of this. And it will help make England, again, into the world superpower. Now, in order for the British East India Trading Company to work, it needs to be able to have global trade, obviously. And William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution will merge English and Dutch empires, or trade empires, and their merged naval interest. So England's economic success will be based on this enormous and rapid mercantile expansion, or trade network, which of course requires open and free trade. And England will become the epicenter of free trade in the world. The British Navy will become the most powerful navy in human history. And they needed that, obviously, because, one, they're an island, but to enforce free trade, free and open trade. And again, there's a lot of things you can criticize, but the Royal Navy will allow world trade to explode and will be very interested in keeping the seas open for free trade. So they will do a lot to attack and put down pirates to make global trade better. And so they are adapting to globalization. And it is one of the reasons, it is the major reason England will become the world superpower. Because again, globalization since 1500s is associated with a country being economically advanced, and it's the only way a country can economically excel. By the mid-1800s, the Royal Navy had almost as many ships as all other nations' fleets combined. So it is massive. And that absolutely enormous fleet and the building will spur England to become the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, which we will talk about later. They're needed to create ironworks to manufacture cannons, blast furnaces for coals, and it will lead directly to the first steam engines to pump water from mines, which steam engines are a more advanced form of energy. Like windmills are obviously not a very advanced form, but steam engine will be a more advanced one that will set England up to be the first country to benefit from the Industrial Revolution, which is why England will be the world economic superpower for 200 years until it is overtaken by its former colony, the United States, during the Second Industrial Revolution in the latter part of the 1800s. So the British Navy will be used to enforce free and open trade. And by 1700, England had surpassed the Dutch, and the gap in wealth and power between England and the Netherlands will only expand. And England will spread those institutions it created and that power to its colonies in America.